Welcome. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to create and publish your podcast. It's free. That's right, free to download. With built-in tools to help you record and edit your podcast from your cell phone or any smart device. Anchor also distributes your podcast on virtually any platform that streams podcasts, like Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Apple and Google Podcasts, and many more. You can even monetize your podcast with no minimum listenership. Anchor is your one-stop app for podcasting. Remember, it's free. Go to anchor.fm to create some amazing content.
Powered by Riverside.
Welcome to the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, where we discuss trigger warning conversations. I am your host, LP, Larry Penson. I am your Paramedics CEO. I have a very special guest today who's going to be talking to us from her subject matter expertise perspective, Professor Theresa AGOSTENELli. She is a wonderful, wonderful individual, very, very highly respected as a psychotherapist. She is going to be having a great discussion with us for the next 40 plus minutes. As always, these conversations are triggering. We discuss domestic violence, sexually based offenses. We're not going to talk about the human and sex trafficking, but we will be talking about the missing persons case, as we do with every episode after the guest drops off. If you are triggered at any point during this audio and or video portion of this podcast, sponsored by Anchor, produced by Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC, we have a bunch of resources that are going to be listed in the show notes. Call 911 because I'm not going to show up. Professor Theresa is not going to show up. We also have the domestic violence hotline and phone number. We have the trafficking hotline and phone number. We have the sexual abuse hotline and phone number. We have 3 of these substance abuse hotlines and phone numbers: Al-Anon, Narcotics Anonymous, AA. My guest host, I would say, because this is a conversation that we're going to have. And 80% of the conversations that we do is the guest speaking, because it's not about me. It's about you. Professor Theresa, you have such a long CV. I'm just going to read some of this stuff. You're the president of the Glenn Mills Coaching and Consulting. You're a CEO. You're a licensed psychotherapist. You're a professor. You're a certified independent John C. Maxwell speaker. I can go on and on, but I'm not, because I'm going to have all your contact information listed. You got a 10K card. I got a 10K card. We're going to have all that information listed in the show notes. Let's just go ahead and jump into it. As you know, domestic violence and sexually based offenses are a huge problem worldwide, but we're going to talk about what's going on here in the good old US of A. Now, we do have a worldwide audience listening, so they can benefit from your knowledge base. I want to start with how you got into therapy, how you became a psychotherapist. Just briefly, just kind of give us the rundown on how you became Professor Theresa.
My whole life, I loved helping people. So let me fast forward to how I became a therapist. Over time, I had started getting my life together, and my brother was killed in a car accident, which kind of sent me backwards a little bit. I lost another brother due to suicide, and I met Vince. Vince and I started dating. We met at a church, and his sister and her baby were murdered, a random act of a violent murder for the 19-month-old and a 29-year-old. And I watched the family go through the trial. I watched the family go through the grief and the horrors of reliving this trial, and I saw victim services. I'd never heard of victim services, which is in our area, Delaware County, Montgomery County, Chester County, Philadelphia County. What a wonderful organization. And that is exactly where I fell in love with helping those who have had significant traumatic experiences. And so that's how I became a therapist. I delved deeper into my education and I became licensed as a clinical psychotherapist. And then through
Okay.
a friend of mine and a colleague, I was asked to teach at a local university here in the Philadelphia area. And I began teaching grief and loss across the lifespan and trauma tracks. So that's
Okay.
how I got to be where I am today. So thank you. I hope that was quick enough.
That was perfect. You know, for me, as someone who is a first responder, even though I'm retired, I always tell people 85% of your 911 calls that come out are for EMS. And with that, we deal with a lot of mental health responses. You know, you can break it down into two types of calls. You have your traumas and your medical. So your traumas are your gunshots, car accidents, fires, and all that stuff. Your medicals are going to be your heart attacks, your strokes, your low blood sugars or hypoglycemia, stuff like that, including mental health crisis. And so as a paramedic, I've been in EMS since 2006. So I've gotten calls on thousands of mental health related issues, from anxieties, panic attacks, bipolar issues, you know, all kind of things, just across the spectrum. For you being a psychotherapist, let's start with domestic violence. The people that you see, do you call them patients or clients?
I call them clients.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And I know that makes a difference based on your licensure and all that stuff. So the clients that
You're not allowed to call them patients anymore.
okay, and that's why I was going to ask. Okay, why is that?
Well, because that denotes that there's something wrong. So technically, the word is consumers. They're called consumers seeking the help.
I see. This show is about education. It's about advocacy and it's about awareness. I'd never heard that. So, is this a legal thing or is this kind of a cultural thing in therapy?
It's a cultural thing. So
Okay.
now, yeah, because people don't want to be considered patients or clients. They're consumers because they're looking for value.
Consumers. Okay. The consumers that you speak with, how do you generally come across them? How do you get these consumers to come into your office virtually and or in person?
So when I first started out, one of my very first jobs early in my career was the domestic abuse place. It's called DAP, Domestic Abuse Place, here in my local area. And my job was to assess, diagnose, and treat those who would come in, walk in random consumers who were experiencing significant domestic violence. It was a shelter and it was a non-disclosed location. So that was my very first job early on. So I began to practice the trauma trained and the therapy for domestic violence. So that is where I started. And with that, I also was helping people from the church that I was in. Church leaders would send me clients who were experiencing significant domestic abuse so that I would help assess, diagnose, and treat. All the way up to today, I still receive referrals from clients and colleagues.
Domestic abuse place. Is this facility in the greater Philly area?
Yes.
Is it still opening and functioning?
Yes, it is.
And you're still affiliated with this organization, this company?
I am working with them. I am a resource. And so, I mean, I still keep in touch with them, and I will send them clients who need a place to go immediately. They will send me clients who need long-term care.
Okay. Do you see men and women?
Yes, I do. Interesting question, because now more than ever, even with COVID, because of the fact that so many people were stuck together for so long, we've seen an uptick in men who have been abused.
Okay.
And of course, with same-sex relationships, we have seen where same-sex men in a same-sex relationship, there's significant abuse there too.
I want to jump to that part of it. I want to start with the men because this, we got Father's Day coming up, and I like talking about men's issues. Part of the reason that I started this podcast is because, you and I met in Clubhouse, and I'm always in these rooms where we're talking about mental health. And I've noticed that I'm either the only guy or a handful of guys that come into these mental health spaces. Also, I'm either the only first responder or maybe one of two first responders that have these conversations. That's really troubling for me because, again, we get called on these issues. We respond to these issues. When those tones drop, we get suited and booted. We got a duty to respond and different things like that. We show up. Now, we may have to stage because if there's a safety issue or something like that, we'll be 2 or 3 blocks away waiting for the cops to tell the dispatcher, hey, call the EMS crew in. They can come in. We got the scene secured. Men typically don't like talking about their shit. Now, we use all kind of language on this show. It's uncensored conversation. So we just say what it is. It is what we say. Men don't like talking about their shit. They are taught how to suppress their emotions as young boys. I remember going through that with relatives of mine. I had a relative that told me the only reason that a boy should cry is because of a few reasons. He's crushed between a couple cars, fell off a building, somebody's dead or dying. Maybe you won or lost some major sporting event. Got a bone sticking out of your body or something like that. It's not something that is very human. And so for the men that you see, how do you address getting them to open up and share those traumas with you, especially when it comes to domestic violence and sexually based offenses? Because we know that there's the stigmas, the taboos, and the stereotypes with sexually based offenses with men. On the domestic violence side, it's more, well, how could you be a victim of domestic violence? You're the guy. She was 120 pounds soaking wet. You're 250. How can she abuse you? Will you address those 2 points of view?
Absolutely. So when it comes to men being abused, a lot of times what we find is it could be mental abuse, verbal abuse. It could be spiritual abuse. They make fun of their religion, or they make fun of their God, or they down their God and embarrass them. So there are significant kinds of abuse that happen when a female is abusing a male, and even in a same-sex relationship where it's 2 men who are partners. What I have found is sometimes a man who has been taught you don't fight back, you don't respond, you walk away. What I have found is sometimes that really pisses off the abuser, the female abuser, or the other partner. And so I've had men clients who've been stabbed with scissors, they've been stabbed with knives, they've been threatened verbally, mentally, cleaned out their bank account, there's financial abuse. So I've also had cases where the person was beat up in their sleep, hit with a hammer, startled out of a sleep. Those are very significant abuses where a person is startled out of their sleep continuously, so that there's significant trauma and there's a high level of anxiety, and that fight or flight mentality begins to take over. And So they are on high alert all the time. They're very anxious. They're very easily provoked. And so I have found that there are very specific kinds of ways that a female will abuse her male counterpart.
When you say startle, give me some examples of the startling that is done to these men in their sleep.
So, for instance, you have a person who comes home, is very tired, goes to bed early, and the abuser is what I would say triggered. Something has triggered this abuser. It could be the fact that the partner is not paying attention, the partner is tired, the partner is sleeping, and the person will jump on them, yell at them, hit them with something, try to burn them, to startle them out of sleep.
Okay.
And when that's done continuously, that is a very that hits hard on the mental psyche of someone who continually is startled out of a sound sleep.
What would you say the ratio of consumers that you see, men to women?
I would say probably maybe 1 out of 4. But some of the statistics that we read about, they're not always very clear because a lot of people won't admit, especially with men. So we can't go by statistics we read because we really don't know, because many of the men being abused will not come to tell you. So I would say 1 out of 4 for me across the board, which is very low. I have, and I can get into in a moment that with law enforcement, first responders, that as you were talking about, lots of abuse there. So I would say maybe 1 out of 4 men who are being abused would want to talk about it. They're embarrassed. They feel shame. There's a stigma that, oh my gosh, if you are a male being abused, then you're wimpy, you're a big baby, you're a wuss. So we can't really say for sure what the ratio is, but I would say for me, maybe 1 out of 4.
One of the NBC affiliates here in Charlotte posted an article. WCNC Charlotte is a news agency, and they were talking about men and the statistics on domestic violence and how the numbers don't. Well, from their report, they were saying that basically men are not reporting these issues enough, and they went into why that is. And I talked to Mrs. LP, and she said, I actually think the numbers are a lot worse than what they were showing in this article. And I said, why did you say that? And she said, well, think about how many of these things are going underreported or not reported at all. Not just underreported, but just not reported at all. And we know that these issues happen. It's just, again, this taboo thing. How can you be abused by a woman? Just in general. Some people honestly believe men cannot be abused by a woman, especially physically. Now, when you start talking about other forms like emotional and financial and spiritual, you might start garnering some head nods and different things like that. But when it comes to physical, it's like, no, it's either it is or it ain't. I want to jump into the sexually based offenses discussion when it comes to men. What type of offenses are you dealing with in your therapy sessions with men when it comes to these sexual based offenses?
When you mean they're being abused, the men?
Yeah. Whether it's something that's current or when they were younger.
So I have had clients who were sexually abused as children.
Mm-hmm.
I've had several of those over the years. Many cases where a child was abused, and years later, because it was taboo back then, it wasn't addressed, it wasn't talked about. The person's an adult and they're experiencing significant acute mental illnesses due to having trauma by being abused as a child from several members of family over the years, and it was never addressed or treated. And so we find that it comes on later as somebody is triggered by something, and then it can bring on a psychotic break. So I've had a lot of clients over the years, men as well as women, who were sexually abused as children, and who were never treated for that abuse. And their oppressors and abusers were never either found, or they were never brought to trial because of the time limit and the statute.
Say it again.
Because of time limits and the statute of limitations.
Oh, okay. I'm a person that believes silence speaks volumes, especially when it comes to men and these issues, because we tend to not hear from these guys about what happened to them, when it happened to them, why it happened to them, how it affects them, how it affected them then, and how it affects them right now. For you being a psychotherapist, enlighten us on the silent aspect of these traumas in terms of how you get them to be more vocal about it.
That's a great question. It took many sessions to begin to unpack all of that. Because what I found was, if someone, their whole issue is a trust issue. So you've got to build that trust in order for them to trust you to talk about some of their trauma, number one. Secondly, what happens in many, many cases, LP, is that once we start tapping into that trauma, we start having these conversations. The client, the consumer, the patient was triggered, and we would have to take a breather, take a few minutes, talk about something else, come back. So a lot of times the session was prolonged because we had to take a few breathers. The triggers would cause the person to either go into a dissociative personality, sink into a depression. They would act out. They would relive the trauma. So there's a lot of times with clients over the years we've had to stop or end the session. And then also what happens, many times the client would not come back. They would not go for therapy anymore because of the trigger, and they were not able to tap into that healing process, either because of fear, anger, or the traumatic experiences that they faced. So therapy would cease. I saw that a lot.
You're doing virtual and in-person visits? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And for law enforcement and first responders, because as you said earlier, and I want to really talk about this because this is near and dear to my heart, being a first responder. The environment as a first responder, when you're working either for an EMS service, fire department, or both, like I did, you pick this job. You go in knowing that you're going to be dealing with all kind of shit, good, bad, and ugly. You go in knowing that, especially depending on if you work in an urban versus a suburban versus a rural environment, that typically the urban environments are going to be more hellish in terms of the traumas, in terms of the medical stuff. The volume is going to be a lot higher. The transport times are going to be shorter because, like I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. That's where I worked in practice my whole career. You can throw a rock and hit a level 1 to a level 4 hospital. And you can be at a hospital in 15, 20 minutes easy. As a first responder, because we carry so many weights on us in terms of what we're expected to be able to deal with every single call, that adds up to your mental state. Being in St. Louis, we had the private EMS service that I worked for had a contract with St. Louis City Fire and EMS, so we did their backup. They would get like over 90,000 calls a year with 13 ambulances doing 12-hour shifts. Because St. Louis is still considered the murder capital of the U.S., unfortunately, it's been that way for years. They got a high level of traumas that they deal with, gunshots, all these different things or what have you. For those first responders that you deal with, and the reason I bring it up is because the level of homicides, especially suicide rates, are increasing. Substance abuse is increasing dramatically for those responders. But you know what's not increasing? The mental health sign-ups. Those responders signing up for mental health therapy. They get burnt out. They quit. They become addicts. They become suicidal. I want you to talk to us about the first responders that you may have seen and treated and how you approach them, because that's a whole different conversation.
But first responders, they are all empaths. They want to help. They want to help people. They want to change the world. So they go in, and there's a lot of training that goes on. But this is what people don't understand. They're not trained to understand mental health. So they learn on the job a lot of times. That's where the trauma comes in. I'm trained in mental health. I can assess, diagnose, and treat. I'm triaged, right?
Right.
I don't know if I would know what to do in the middle of a shootout. I don't know if I would know what to do, having to go into a home domestic violence call and I have to, knock on the door. They don't know what they're going to get. Firefighters, EMTs, they don't know what they're walking into. And so you bring up a great point. So I've been working with law enforcement for probably almost 10 years. So those are the top three. Definitely go through anger management. Learn how to manage your anger. See, you can't get rid of anger. It's part of life. It's human nature. Is emotion regulation, because when you are hit with significant trauma after, those things build up. And so it's hard to manage and regulate your emotions. So I do a lot of emotion regulation.
Emotion regulation, okay.
Yeah, emotion regulation. It's helping to regulate your emotion. Secondly is helping them find an accountability partner. I prefer it's one of their working buddies, but an accountability partner. And then thirdly, self-care. We've got to make sure that these first responders are getting enough rest, getting enough care, eating right, sleeping right, hydrating correctly. A lot of these, well, I'll just leave it at that. Those are my three top things: learning anger management, emotion regulation, getting an accountability partner, and getting on a good regimen for healthy eating and sleeping.
Professor Theresa, we got a few more minutes. I want to thank you so much for your time and the knowledge that you're kicking out. I know I'm going to have you back. I know I'm going to have you back because, we just scratched the surface, literally, on some of these things. And that's okay. We got to start somewhere. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, especially with other first responders, especially when it comes to crisis incident stress debriefing or crisis incident stress management. So CISD, CISM. And we'll talk about that probably more in detail the next time I have you on the show, because we do another podcast that's called Pre-Hospital EMS Talk, where we talk about those things specifically from a clinical point of view about clinicians and first responders. So I want to wrap up with this. how can people get in touch with you? Give me your social media links, because we'll have all this stuff posted in the show description. But if somebody wants to talk to you, whether it's a first responder or just a regular old Joe or Jill or what have you, no offense to anybody that has an issue with gender identities and stuff, how can they get in touch with you?
There are so many ways. So they can simply call. That is a business line that is always available, 610-808-7401. They can email me at glenmillscc@gmail.com. Glenn Mills, GLENMILLS.cc.com is my website. So those are the two ways you can get a hold of me. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn.
The book that you said you're writing, what's the title of it, and when does it come out, and how can people get it?
So it'll be out any day now. It is in print. It's getting printed. The publishing company has it just about ready. It's called The Grid System, GRID, The Grid System. And it's based on the premise that we are all born with a psychological grid that we fill in over time. And the way we fill it in is based on those early influencers in our lives, even way back when we were in our mother's womb in utero. Those things that were traumatic, dramatic, they carry over. And by the time you're 2 or 3 or 4 years old, you have downloaded enough mental DNA, so to speak, to take you well into your adult years. And so I came up with the grid system to help you fill in your psychological grid, get rid of the negative, get rid of the trauma and the drama, and fill it in so that you can have more of what's good in your life and overcome that trauma and be successful and victorious and not live as a victim, live as a victor. So it's called the Grid System. It'll be out any day. If you want to message me, I have a link. I can send it to you. It's a link that you click on and you put in your email and you'll be on the list. You don't have to buy anything. You'll just be on the list. It'll let you know first. You'll be the first people to know when it's ready. I've gotten so many inquiries. So as soon as the book is launched, it will be in e-form as well.
Okay.
And I will also it'll be on my website. It will be on Amazon. And for those who order it from my website, I will gladly autograph it and write a personal message of love and faith and hope. So thanks.
Well, I want mine autographed, so I'm going to bypass the ebook option. I'm going to bypass the Amazon option. I love when I talk to authors because I'm an avid reader and I collect books, and when I can get an autographed copy, that just means the world to me. So I'm going to go on your website. So yeah, just send me the link to that. I'll post that also in the show notes. Professor Theresa, I want to thank you so much for joining the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. It's been an honor. It's been a blessing. You are helping so many people deal with what I always say is the world's oldest continuous pandemic, and that's mental health crisis, because it affects all aspects of life, including these 4 topics that we talk about that the viewers and the listeners have heard me talk about, see me talk about all the time, every day and twice on Sunday. Again, Professor Theresa AGOSTENELLI, she is just a wonderful human being who's always available. And when the next time I come to Philly, because I haven't been back since 2011, I'm going to look you up and we're going to have some cheesesteaks and some drinks, and we're just going to have some fun, and we're just going to celebrate life, and we're going to give a shout out to all the first responders that we work with. Peace and blessings to you, beloved. Talk to you later.
Thank you for all you do, and thank you for serving. And I just want to tell everybody, never give up. Thank you, Larry. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. We're going to jump into the final phase of the podcast here, and we always talk about a missing person case. And remember, the missing person cases that we cover, 99% of those are African American or Black or brown men, women, and children, because of the lack of media coverage that we tend to see or not see when it comes to those missing individuals. I want to talk about this young lady here, RILYA SHENISE Wilson. She's been missing since January 18th, 2001. She's been missing from Miami, Florida. Her classification is endangered missing. Young female, date of birth 9/29/1996, so she's 25 years old now. She's black or African American. She's 4 years old at the time she was missing. Her height and weight, 3 foot tall, 40 to 50 pounds at the time she was missing. The distinguishing characteristics are African American female, black hair, brown eyes. RILYA, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, RILYA, has a scar from a puncture wound approximately 5 inches below her navel. So this is on her stomach, her abdomen area. 5 inches below her navel. Her ears are pierced. Some agencies give her the middle name Denise. So RILYA Denise or SHENISE Wilson. This information that I'm reading about this missing young woman now, is from the Charlie Project. So the charlieproject.org has this information. Let's see. The details of her disappearance are as follows. RILYA and her 2 siblings were removed from their mother's custody when RILYA was an infant. They were placed with Geraldine Graham, their alleged grandmother or godmother, in Miami, Florida in the year 2000. Their mother, Gloria Wilson, abused cocaine and neglected her children. Her parental rights were eventually terminated. Photos of Gloria and Graham are posted in this case study. Florida's Department of Children and Families were obliged or obligated to check on the children's well-being during monthly visits. The final recorded visit for the family took place in early January of 2001 when their social worker, Deborah, sometimes spelled Deborah, Muskelly, stopped by Graham's residence. A photo of Muskelly is posted in this case summary. Graham told authorities that an unidentified African-American female arrived at their home in the 10,100 block of Southwest 145th Place on January 18, 2001. The individual claimed to work for the DCF and said that she was removing RILYA from the home for an evaluation. RILYA had reportedly been diagnosed with behavior problems prior to the visit. She has never been heard from again. Graham said that the alleged abductor spoke with a thick accent that may have been African in origin. The woman, Graham said, was extremely familiar with RILYA's history and said Muskelly was aware of her visit. Graham stated 2 other people visited her home in February 2001 and requested additional toys to help RILYA become accustomed to her new surroundings. Muskelly and her supervisor, Willie Harris, resigned from the DCF in March 2002 amid accusations that their records of home visits were fraudulent. The agency contacted Graham during its investigation into Muskelly's records. Authorities heard and learned about RILYA's possible abduction in April 2002, 15 months after the child disappeared. Graham said that Muskelly was not one of the individuals who visited her home 1 month after RILYA disappeared. Muskelly's attorney said that his client offered to cooperate with authorities regarding RILYA's case. He also claimed that Muskelly was being used as a scapegoat by the DCF to mask its own internal problems. This article goes on and on and on about the details of this case. I'm not going to read all of this stuff because I want people to really deep dive into this article. I want them to do their own research because this is going to help find this young woman now who was 4 years old when she was missing. I'm going to jump down to the last 3 paragraphs. There was a trial that took place during December 2012 and January 2013. There were a number of people who were among witnesses that testified, including Muskelly. Graham's attorney argued that there was no evidence RILYA was dead and suggested that she had been sold. Sold. This is 2001 all the way through 2022. The jury was told that this young girl was sold. The jury convicted Graham of kidnapping and child abuse, but deadlocked 11-1 on that charge of murder. The jury declared a mistrial on the murder charges, and Graham was sentenced to 55 years in prison for the crimes she was convicted of. As she is presently in her late 60s, the sentence will probably keep her in prison for the rest of her life. Nevertheless, the prosecution has elected to retry on the murder charge. Graham is awaiting her second murder trial. RILYA has never been located, but foul play is suspected in her case due to the circumstances involved. This case is so troubling to me on so many levels. The fact that they're talking about she was sold. We're not in times of slavery. The Charlie Project does a great job at detailing and documenting these cases. If you have any information about the whereabouts, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, alive or dead, about RILYA Wilson, contact the Miami-Dade Police Department, 305-418-7302. Again, contact the Miami-Dade Police Department, 305-418-7302. I'm going to post the link to this case like we do at every ending of the podcast. I want to thank you all so much for joining us on this episode of the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. Remember, live in awareness, don't live in fear. Make sure that you keep an open mind when it comes to missing persons, especially those that are Black or brown men, women, and children. Their lives matter, their whereabouts matter, and we want to bring the same energy and media coverage and attention to those Black and brown individuals as our non-Black and brown individuals, because that's how we get back to our humanity. And with that, I'm LP. Thank you so much. And until next time, peace and blessings be upon you and your families forevermore. LP out.